The February wind cut through the streets of downtown Chicago like a knife, carrying with it the promise of snow that had been threatening all week. Victoria Stone pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down West Randolph Street, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. She was running late again, though only by 5 minutes this time. The morning had started badly when her ancient radiator had finally given up, leaving her tiny studio apartment in Pilsen feeling more like a freezer than a home. Victoria had been working at the Prime Cut for 3 years and 2 months, long enough to know every quirk of the upscale steakhouse, but not quite long enough to feel truly secure in her position. The restaurant occupied a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls, Edison bulb lighting, and leather booths that probably cost more than her monthly rent. It catered to Chicago's elite, the kind of people who ordered $50 steaks without glancing at the price and left tips that could cover her grocery bill for a week if she was lucky. At 28 years old, Victoria had become an expert at being invisible. It was a skill she had cultivated deliberately over the past 4 years, ever since she had fled Boston in the middle of a rainy October night with nothing but a hastily packed suitcase and $300 in cash. Marcus had been a successful attorney, charming and attentive during their first months together, but that attention had gradually transformed into something darker. He needed to know where she was at all times, who she spoke to, what she was thinking. When she had finally tried to leave, he had made it clear that he considered her his property. Chicago had offered her anonymity in a way that smaller cities could not. She had found the studio apartment through a Craigslist ad, paying cash to a landlord who asked no questions. The neighborhood of Pilsen was mostly Mexican families and young artists, a colorful working-class area where a quiet white woman who kept to herself attracted no particular notice. She had found the job at the Prime Cut through sheer persistence, showing up every day for a week until the manager, Robert, finally agreed to give her a trial shift. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the Prime Cut at exactly 5:45, 15 minutes before her shift officially began. Robert found her as she was checking her section, making sure the silverware was properly aligned and the water glasses spotless. He was a nervous man in his mid-40s, perpetually worried about reviews and the opinions of the owner whom Victoria had never actually met. Tonight, though, his anxiety seemed elevated to a new level. Jessica, their most experienced server, had called in sick at the last minute. A party of 6 had reserved the private dining room, important guests, the kind who could make or break the restaurant's reputation with a single phone call. Robert needed Victoria to take the booking even though she normally worked the main floor. Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety but nodded her agreement. She needed this job desperately. Her rent was due in a week, and she was still paying off credit card debt from those first desperate months in Chicago. At 7 o'clock precisely, the party of 6 arrived. The men entered in a cluster, all dressed in expensive suits that fit too perfectly to be off the rack. Victoria's first impression was of contained power, the kind of confidence that came not from wealth alone, but from the certainty of being obeyed. One man stood out immediately. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35 at most, with dark hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his eyes. Those eyes were a striking gray-blue, the color of Lake Michigan on a stormy day. His suit was charcoal, probably Italian, worn with the casual ease of someone who had been dressing this way his entire adult life. She took their drink orders efficiently, nodding the preferences with practiced memory. The requests were predictable for men of their apparent wealth. Scotch, mostly, aged and expensive. The dark-haired man was last. He studied her for a moment before requesting a particular single malt that she recognized as one of the most expensive bottles in the restaurant's collection. His voice when he spoke was quiet, almost soft, but there was something in it that suggested he never had to raise his voice to be heard. The meal proceeded according to the careful choreography of fine dining. Victoria took their food orders, brought courses at precisely timed intervals. The men spoke in low voices, sometimes in English, sometimes in what sounded like Italian or possibly Spanish. She caught fragments of conversation that meant nothing to her, references to shipments and territories, percentages and obligations. It was during the main course that her phone began to vibrate in the pocket of her apron. This was highly unusual. She kept her phone on silent during shifts, but the phone buzzed again, and then again, insistent and urgent. The dark-haired man glanced up at her, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. She murmured an apology and slipped out of the room as quickly as possible. In the narrow hallway outside, her hands were shaking as she pulled the phone from her pocket. The screen showed 3 missed calls from a number she did not recognize, a 215 area code that she knew was Philadelphia. Her heart began to pound with a sick certainty that something was very wrong. Caitlin was her only real connection to her old life, her baby sister who had been just 19 when Victoria had fled Boston. She pressed the callback button with trembling fingers. The voice was male, professional, with the carefully neutral tone of someone who delivered bad news as part of their job. He identified himself as Dr. Rashid from Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia and asked if he was speaking to Victoria Stone, listed as the emergency contact for Caitlin Stone. Victoria's legs felt suddenly weak as she confirmed her identity. There had been an accident. Caitlin had been hit by a car while crossing Broad Street just after midnight. Multiple fractures to her legs and pelvis, internal bleeding, head trauma that required immediate surgery. She was currently stable but critical. The surgery was necessary and urgent, but it was not fully covered by Caitlin's student insurance. The hospital needed authorization and payment arrangements for the procedure, which would cost in excess of $100,000, with the insurance covering perhaps 30% at most. Victoria's mind went blank. Caitlin was hurt, possibly dying, and needed surgery that Victoria could not possibly afford. Her sister was all the family she had left. Their parents had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Victoria had been 23, Caitlin just 17, and the grief had nearly destroyed them both. The doctor was waiting for a response. He needed authorization for the surgery, needed payment information, needed Victoria to come to Philadelphia as soon as possible. Victoria ended the call with promises she had no idea how to keep. She had perhaps $3,000 in her savings account, the most she had managed to accumulate in 4 years. Her credit was still recovering from the damage Marcus had inflicted. No bank would give her a loan large enough to cover even a fraction of the surgical costs. She could call Marcus, but the thought was immediately rejected. Going back to him would mean surrendering everything she had built, such as it was. She became aware that she had been gone from the private dining room for far too long. She wiped her eyes roughly, trying to compose herself. When she re-entered the room, the men were in the midst of what appeared to be a serious discussion. They barely glanced at her as she slipped back to her station by the wall. But her hands betrayed her when she reached for a water pitcher, the slight tremor making the liquid shimmer in the crystal. The dark-haired man was watching her again. She felt his gaze like a physical weight. When she approached to clear his plate, he spoke quietly, his voice pitched so only she could hear. He asked if everything was all right, and the simple, unexpected kindness of the question nearly undid her completely. Victoria opened her mouth to deliver the automatic reassurance, but what came out instead was something between a yes and a sob. Her voice cracked on the single syllable, and she felt hot tears threatening to spill over. She turned away quickly, mortified by her loss of composure. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of barely controlled panic. Victoria served dessert and coffee with shaking hands, processed the payment with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. The dark-haired man left a tip that seemed excessive even by the standards of the Prime Cut's wealthy clientele, but she barely registered the amount. All she could think about was Caitlin lying in a hospital bed, broken and bleeding, while Victoria stood helpless and useless hundreds of miles away. When the party finally departed, and she was alone in the private room collecting glasses and straightening chairs, Victoria allowed herself to break down for just a moment. She sank into one of the leather chairs and wept silently for her sister, for their parents, for the impossible situation that had no solution she could see. Tomorrow, she would figure something out. She would call the hospital back, negotiate payment plans, maybe take out predatory payday loans. But tonight, alone in that empty room with the city lights of Chicago glittering through the windows, Victoria Stone let herself acknowledge the truth. She was drowning, and there was no lifeline in sight. Victoria woke the next morning after perhaps 2 hours of fitful sleep, her mind still spinning with impossible calculations. The winter sunlight filtering through her thin curtains seemed accusatory, highlighting the shabbiness of her studio apartment. She checked her phone immediately, finding only a terse text message from Dr. Rashid's office reminding her that authorization and payment arrangements were still pending. She dressed quickly in her only business-appropriate outfit, a gray pencil skirt and white blouse bought at a thrift store years ago, and set out into the frozen Chicago morning with a folder full of hastily printed bank statements. Her plan involved visiting every bank within walking distance and begging for a personal loan large enough to cover at least part of Caitlin's surgery. The first bank was a Chase branch 3 blocks from her apartment. The loan officer was a young woman perhaps Victoria's own age, professionally pleasant with perfectly applied makeup. She listened to Victoria's request with practiced sympathy, typed information into her computer, and delivered the rejection with gentle finality. Victoria's credit score was too low, her income insufficient, her employment history too short. Without collateral, a car or property, there was nothing they could do. The second bank was a local credit union advertising community-focused lending. The loan officer there was an older man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely troubled by her situation. He spent longer reviewing her application, but ultimately arrived at the same conclusion. Without a cosigner or significant assets, the risk was simply too high. He suggested medical payment plans with the hospital, perhaps a GoFundMe campaign, options that Victoria knew would take far too long. By the third bank, Victoria's composure was crumbling. The rejection there was quicker and less gentle, delivered by a loan officer who barely glanced at her paperwork. Victoria found herself arguing, her voice rising with desperation, explaining that this was life or death, that her sister would die without this money. Security escorted her out when she refused to leave his office. She stood on the sidewalk in the bitter cold, humiliated and defeated. Her phone rang, and she answered without checking the caller ID. It was the hospital's billing department, informing her that they needed a 50% deposit before they could proceed with surgery that evening. Without that deposit, they would have to transfer Caitlin to a county hospital, though the woman's tone suggested this would significantly compromise care. For a wild moment, Victoria considered calling Marcus. Her ex-fiancé had money, plenty of it. Perhaps if she begged, if she promised him anything, he would help. But Marcus's love had been a cage, possessive and suffocating. If she went back to him now in absolute need, she would never escape again. Victoria spent the afternoon walking the streets of Chicago without direction. She researched predatory payday loan companies, looking at interest rates that would trap her in debt for decades, but might provide immediate cash. The numbers never worked out. By the time she needed to leave for her evening shift at the Prime Cut, she had accomplished nothing except confirming that she was powerless to help the only person in the world she still loved. The restaurant was already bustling when she arrived. She changed into her uniform mechanically and moved into the dining room to begin another evening of serving people who would spend more on a single meal than she needed to save her sister's life. Her phone vibrated twice during service with calls from Philadelphia that she could not answer. During her break, she listened to the voicemails in the staff bathroom. Dr. Rashid's voice was grave, saying Caitlin's condition had deteriorated and they could not wait much longer. Hospital administration informed her that without payment by midnight, they would initiate the transfer to county facilities in the morning. The evening shift was mercifully busy, which meant less time to think. She was closing out her last table around 10:30 when Robert appeared, looking nervous. He informed her that a guest at the bar had requested her service specifically, someone important who should not be kept waiting. When Victoria rounded the corner and saw who was sitting there, her steps faltered. It was the dark-haired man from the private dining room the night before, the one with the storm-colored eyes who had asked if she was all right. He sat at the bar in the same expensive suit, a glass of amber liquid before him. The restaurant was officially closed, which meant someone had let him in after hours. She approached cautiously, her exhaustion making her less guarded than normal. He gestured to the stool beside him, and she found herself sitting. Her hands were still trembling, and she folded them in her lap to hide the shaking. He studied her for a long moment. Then, with a deliberate motion, he reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the bar between them. Through the paper, Victoria could see the unmistakable green of currency. Her heart began to pound. He began to speak in that quiet, commanding voice. He had noticed her distress the previous evening and had made some inquiries. He knew about Caitlin, about the accident, about the hospital's demands for payment. He knew about her failed loan attempts that morning, about the calls from Philadelphia, about the midnight deadline rapidly approaching. Victoria asked how he knew all of this. What kind of man investigated a random waitress so thoroughly in less than 24 hours? He smiled slightly and said simply that information was his business, that knowing things about people was how he survived in his world. Then he made his offer. He would pay for Caitlin's surgery in full, would arrange for her transfer to the best private hospital in Philadelphia with the finest trauma surgeons on the East Coast. He would ensure she received whatever follow-up care and rehabilitation she needed. The envelope contained $10,000 in cash for immediate expenses, and he would handle the hospital billing directly. In exchange, Victoria would work for him. She asked what kind of work he meant. He explained that he needed someone who could be present in certain places, who could observe and listen and remember details. Nothing dangerous, he assured her, nothing illegal or immoral. Simply the work of eyes and ears in rooms where people said things they thought were private. Victoria felt cold clarity settle over her. He was asking her to be an informant, to spy on people, to trade her integrity for her sister's life. Every moral instinct screamed at her to refuse. But she heard Dr. Rashid's voice in her memory explaining that Caitlin had hours, not days. She asked what would happen if she refused. He shrugged elegantly. He would walk away, and she would be left exactly where she was, powerless and desperate with a dying sister. The choice was hers, but it needed to be made immediately. Victoria's hand moved toward the envelope almost of its own accord. She thought about Caitlin, 23 years old with her whole life ahead of her, studying elementary education because she wanted to teach children. She thought about going to Philadelphia for a funeral instead of a hospital visit. The choice was not really a choice at all. She took the envelope. He withdrew a business card from his pocket and placed it beside her hand, matte black with nothing except a phone number in silver ink. He told her to call when she returned from Philadelphia. Her sister would be transferred to Pennsylvania Hospital in the morning, where Dr. Chen, one of the finest trauma surgeons in the country, would be waiting. He had booked her a first-class ticket on the 6 a.m. flight to Philadelphia. A car would collect her at 4:30. Victoria asked who he was. He smiled that cold smile and told her she could call him Collins. Just Collins. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out into the Chicago night. Victoria sat alone at the bar for a long time, the envelope heavy in her hands. She opened it finally and counted the bills inside, crisp hundreds that smelled of ink and possibility. $10,000, more money than she had ever held at once. She thought about all the times she had needed money over the past 4 years, all the nights she had gone to bed hungry to save on groceries. And now here it was, offered by a stranger in exchange for compromises she had never thought she would make. She walked home through empty streets at midnight, the envelope tucked deep in her purse. She did not sleep that night, just packed a small bag and watched the clock. At Fort Wentworth, headlights pulled up outside her building, a black town car with a silent driver. The flight passed in a blur. First class was a revelation of comfort she had never experienced, but Victoria barely noticed. Another car waited in Philadelphia, another silent driver who knew exactly where to take her. Pennsylvania Hospital was old and grand, built of brick and tradition. A woman in a tailored suit met her in the lobby and escorted her through antiseptic corridors. Caitlin was already in a private room, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, her face pale but alive. Victoria stood in the doorway watching her sister sleep, relief and guilt warring in her chest. Dr. Chen explained that surgery was scheduled for that afternoon, that the prognosis was good, that Caitlin should make a full recovery. When Caitlin woke briefly, confused and hurting, Victoria was there to promise that everything would be all right. Caitlin asked how, and Victoria lied with a smile, said she had savings. Caitlin's eyes closed again, too weak to question further. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Victoria waited in a private family room that Collins had apparently arranged. When Dr. Chen finally appeared, his expression was tired but satisfied. The surgery had gone well, better than expected. Caitlin would need months of physical therapy, would walk with a slight limp probably, but she would walk, would live, would have the future that had seemed impossible. Victoria stayed in Philadelphia for 3 days, sitting with Caitlin through the worst of the pain, through the first difficult attempts at physical therapy. When she finally boarded the flight back to Chicago, Caitlin was stable and improving. On the plane, Victoria took out the black business card and stared at the silver numbers. She thought about everything she had gained and everything she had lost. Her sister's life in exchange for her own freedom, security purchased with moral compromise. When she landed in Chicago, she knew she would call that number, would begin whatever arrangement Collins had planned. She had made her choice, had sold herself to the devil in a nice suit. But as she watched the city lights of Chicago appear through the window, she found that she could not bring herself to regret it. Caitlin was alive, and for that, Victoria would pay almost any price. Victoria returned to Chicago on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day when the lake wind cut through even the warmest coat. She had spent a week in Philadelphia watching Caitlin progress from critical to stable to improving, watching the color return to her sister's face, and the strength gradually come back to her voice. The doctors had been everything Collins had promised, attentive and skilled, and optimistic about Caitlin's long-term prognosis. Physical therapy would take months, but Caitlin would walk and run and live a normal life. Her studio apartment felt smaller and shabbier than she remembered. She unpacked her single bag mechanically and sat on her bed staring at the black business card. She had memorized the number by now, but had not yet called. Some part of her had hoped that Collins might change his mind, but she knew better. Men like Collins did not make offers they did not intend to collect on. The text message arrived that evening as she was preparing for her shift at the Prime Cut. An address in the Gold Coast neighborhood, a time the following evening, and nothing more. Victoria stared at the message for a long time before responding with a single word confirming she would be there. Her finger hesitated over the send button for a moment, one last chance to refuse. Then she pressed send. The next evening she dressed carefully in the only nice outfit she owned that was not her work uniform, a simple black dress she had bought years ago for job interviews. The address Collins had provided was in one of Chicago's most exclusive neighborhoods, where the wealthy lived in glass towers overlooking Lake Michigan. The building was all steel and glass with a lobby that looked like an art gallery and a security desk staffed by men in suits. She gave her name at the desk and was directed to a private elevator that required a key card to operate. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor, and when the elevator doors opened directly into the living space, Victoria forgot to breathe. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the room, offering a panoramic view of the city and the lake beyond. The interior was all clean lines and expensive materials, furniture that looked sculptural rather than functional. Collins was waiting for her in the living area, but he looked different from the intimidating figure who had sat at the restaurant bar. He wore jeans and a simple shirt, no shoes, his dark hair slightly disheveled. He held a glass of red wine and looked younger somehow, less like a predator and more like an ordinary wealthy man relaxing in his home. He greeted her with a slight smile and gestured for her to sit on one of the low modern couches. He poured her a glass of wine without asking if she wanted it. Victoria sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, accepting the wine but not drinking it, waiting for him to explain what he expected from her. Collins began to outline what he called the arrangement. Victoria would continue working at the Prime Cut, maintaining her normal schedule and routines. However, approximately once a week she would be required to work at private events that Collins organized. These might be dinner parties, cocktail receptions, charity galas, business functions. Her role would be serving drinks or food, maintaining the kind of invisible presence that allowed guests to forget they were being observed. But her true purpose would be to listen, to watch, to remember details and conversations. Victoria asked what kind of information he was seeking. Collins explained with patience that information was the most valuable currency in his world. Knowledge of who was meeting with whom, who owed money or favors to whom, who was planning to betray partners or leave spouses, who had secrets they desperately wanted to keep hidden. All of this could be monetized through leverage and influence. As he spoke, Victoria began to understand the true scope of what she had agreed to. This was a comprehensive intelligence operation that touched on every aspect of how power and money moved through Chicago's elite circles. Collins was running a private surveillance network, and she was about to become one of his operatives. She asked the question that had been haunting her. What if the information she gathered led to someone getting hurt or killed? Collins looked at her with complete seriousness. He stated clearly that he was not in the business of violence, that he did not order killings, that his work was about information and influence rather than bloodshed. But he warned her that his world intersected with people who were not so scrupulous. If she chose to continue, she would inevitably see and hear things that would haunt her. He was offering her one final chance to walk away. Victoria thought about Caitlin in that hospital bed, about the bills that would continue to arrive for months, about 4 years of barely surviving. She told Collins she was staying, that she would do what he asked. Something that might have been respect flickered across his face, and he nodded. Then he retrieved a folder containing details of her first assignment. The following months settled into a strange rhythm. Her days at the Prime Cut continued as before, but once or twice a week she would receive a text message with an address and time, and she would transform into someone else entirely. The events varied in nature and scale. Sometimes intimate dinner parties in private homes, sometimes large charity galas, occasionally corporate functions. Victoria learned to move through these spaces like a ghost, serving champagne with a pleasant blank expression that discouraged conversation. She heard conversations about real estate deals weeks before they were publicly announced. She learned about marriages falling apart. She overheard discussions of financial schemes that skirted the edges of legality. She discovered that wealthy people having affairs were remarkably careless about discussing their indiscretions in front of service staff they considered beneath notice. Victoria passed all of this information to Collins in brief meetings in neutral locations. Coffee shops where she could sit with a laptop, parks where they could walk and talk, once in a parking garage. She would relay what she had seen and heard, and Collins would listen intently, his mind working through implications. He always thanked her, and sometimes when the information was particularly valuable, he would give her bonuses in cash. The money was substantial enough that she began to build actual savings for the first time in years. Gradually, the nature of her interactions with Collins began to shift. He started asking her personal questions during their meetings, inquiring about her life before Chicago, her hopes for the future. Victoria was cautious at first, but Collins was patient and perceptive, and slowly she found herself sharing things she had not spoken about in years. She told him about her parents, about the grief that had nearly consumed her, about her dreams of going to college. She even spoke carefully about Marcus, about the fear that had finally driven her to flee. Collins listened without judgment. In return, he began to reveal fragments of his own history. He had grown up in Chicago, but not in wealthy neighborhoods. His father had been a police officer who died in the line of duty when Collins was 15. He had put himself through college and law school, though he had never practiced law in the conventional sense. Instead, he had discovered that his real talent was for understanding people, for seeing connections and leverage points that others missed. Victoria found herself looking forward to these meetings in a way that had nothing to do with the money. Collins was intelligent and well-read, with an unexpected sense of humor. He recommended books and they would discuss them. He asked her opinion on current events and seemed genuinely interested. For the first time since fleeing Boston, Victoria felt like someone actually saw her as a person. One evening in late spring, Collins sent her a different kind of message. He invited her to dinner, specifying that this was not work-related, just dinner if she was interested. Victoria stared at the message for a long time, understanding the significance. This was crossing a line they had both been careful to maintain. She should have declined, but she found herself typing yes before she could overthink it. The restaurant was small and intimate in Little Italy, the kind of place where families had been dining for generations. Collins was already there when she arrived, and he stood when he saw her, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. They talked for hours that night, the conversation flowing easily. Collins told her stories about growing up in Chicago, about the neighborhood he came from. Victoria found herself laughing at his descriptions of childhood misadventures. She shared her own memories of a happier time, before loss had defined her life. When Collins asked if she regretted accepting his offer that night at the restaurant, Victoria answered honestly that she did not know. She had gained financial security, but had also lost something of herself, some moral clarity that could never be fully recovered. Collins said quietly that he understood, that his own path had involved similar compromises. As they left the restaurant and walked along the quiet streets, Collins did something unexpected. He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Victoria's first instinct was to pull away, but instead she squeezed his hand in return, and they walked in silence back toward the train station. At the station entrance, Collins stopped and turned to face her. He said he knew this was complicated, but that he wanted to see her again outside of their arrangement. He wanted to know her not as an operative, but as a person. Victoria looked up at him, at the face that had seemed so cold when she first saw it but now appeared merely guarded. She told him that she wanted that too, even as the words felt like jumping off a cliff. Collins smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features, and kissed her forehead gently before stepping back. Then he turned and walked away into the spring night, leaving Victoria standing at the train station with her hand still warm from his touch, and her mind full of questions about what she was becoming. The weeks following their dinner in Little Italy brought a shift in the dynamic between Victoria and Collins that both of them seemed to acknowledge without directly addressing. Their meetings became more frequent, often extending beyond the practical necessities of her reporting on the events she had worked. Collins would suggest coffee after she had finished relaying information, or they would find themselves walking through Grant Park for an hour discussing books and philosophy rather than surveillance details. Victoria noticed that she checked her phone more often, hopping for messages from him, and felt a flutter of anticipation when his name appeared on her screen. Collins began sharing more about himself during these extended conversations. He told her that his real first name was Dominic, though most people in his professional life knew him only by his surname. His parents had immigrated from Sicily when his mother was pregnant with him, settling in the Italian neighborhood where he had grown up surrounded by the tight-knit community of families who had made similar journeys. His father had worked construction and security jobs to support the family, while his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the northern suburbs. When his father died in what was officially ruled a workplace accident, but which Dominic clearly suspected was something more sinister, 15-year-old Dominic had become the man of the house overnight. He had watched his mother work herself to exhaustion trying to keep food on the table for him and his two younger sisters. He had seen how the wealthy families his mother worked for treated her with casual dismissal, how power and money created invisible barriers that determined who mattered and who did not. Those experiences had shaped his understanding of how the world actually worked, beneath the veneer of fairness and meritocracy that people liked to pretend existed. Dominic had been smart enough to earn scholarships, driven enough to work multiple jobs while attending university, ruthless enough to exploit every opportunity that presented itself. Law school had taught him that rules were really just agreements that could be renegotiated if you had sufficient leverage. He had discovered his talent for reading people, for understanding their motivations and fears, for seeing the connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information. His current enterprise, as he carefully termed it, had grown organically from those skills. Victoria found herself fascinated by this glimpse into the formation of the man who had so dramatically altered her life. She recognized in his story echoes of her own experience, the understanding that came from being powerless and watching those with power exercise it carelessly. She told him more about her own history in turn, about her father who had worked as an accountant for a small firm and her mother who had taught elementary school, about the comfortable middle-class childhood that had been shattered by a drunk driver on a rainy highway. She spoke about how Marcus had seemed like salvation in the aftermath of her grief, someone strong and certain who promised to take care of everything, and how she had not recognized the cage being built around her until it was almost too late to escape. Dominic listened to all of this with an intensity that made Victoria feel truly seen for the first time in years. He did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances, did not try to minimize her experiences or rush her through painful memories. When she finished, he simply said that he understood what it meant to be trapped, that his own world was a kind of prison too, a golden cage he had built for himself that he could not leave even if he wanted to. The wealth and power came with obligations and enemies, with the constant need for vigilance and the inability to ever truly trust anyone. He asked her directly if she regretted accepting his offer that night at the restaurant, if she wished she could return to her life before their arrangement. Victoria answered with painful honesty that she did not know. She had gained security and the ability to help Caitlin, but she had also crossed moral lines she had never imagined crossing. She asked him the same question in return, whether he regretted pulling her into his world. Dominic looked at her with an expression that made the air between them feel suddenly charged with electricity. He said without hesitation that he did not regret it, that she had become the best thing in his life in a very long time, that he had not expected to feel this way but could not deny it any longer. The confession hung between them, impossible to ignore or take back. Victoria felt something fundamental shift in her chest, a barrier she had been maintaining crumbling despite all her efforts to keep it intact. When Dominic walked her to catch a taxi that evening, his hand rested on her lower back in a gesture that felt possessive rather than merely polite. Victoria was hyper-aware of the warmth of his palm through the thin fabric of her dress, of how her body responded to his proximity despite all the rational reasons she should maintain distance. In the taxi heading back to Pilsen, she found herself replaying every moment of the evening, analyzing every word and gesture, trying to understand what was happening between them and whether she had any power to stop it even if she wanted to. The tension that had been building found release in an unexpected crisis. Victoria was working an event at a mansion in Kenwood, a fundraiser for some arts organization that attracted the kind of old-money Chicago families who had been wealthy for generations. She was serving champagne to clusters of guests when one of the men, a real estate developer named Richard Castellan, whom she had observed at previous events, cornered her in a hallway away from the main reception rooms. Castellan had clearly been drinking heavily, and his manner shifted from the vague condescension he usually showed service staff to something more predatory. He made comments about her appearance that crossed professional boundaries, stood too close, and when Victoria tried to excuse herself to return to her duties, he grabbed her wrist hard enough to hurt. She pulled away and managed to get back to the public areas, but her hands were shaking, and she felt violated in a way that made it difficult to continue working with her usual composure. She finished the event through sheer force of will, but as soon as she was released for the evening, she found herself calling Dominic from the street outside the mansion. She had not planned to, had told herself she could handle this on her own, but hearing his voice when he answered released something inside her, and she found herself crying as she tried to explain what had happened. Dominic's response was immediate and sharp. He asked where she was and told her to stay there, that he was coming to get her personally. He arrived less than 15 minutes later in a black car that Victoria had not seen before, driven by someone else while he sat in the back. He got out and came to where she stood shivering on the sidewalk, not from cold, but from residual fear and anger. Without a word, he pulled her into an embrace that felt like shelter, his arms solid and protective around her. Then he guided her into the car, and they drove away from the Kenwood mansion in silence. In the car, Dominic asked her calmly who had done this, what exactly had happened. Victoria gave him the name, described Castellan, and what he had said and done. Dominic's expression remained controlled, but Victoria could see something dark and furious behind his eyes, a glimpse of the man who had built his empire through understanding exactly how to hurt people who crossed him. He assured her that Castellan would not be a problem again, and something in his tone made Victoria believe him absolutely. The next day, the news reported that Richard Castellan had been involved in a serious car accident. His vehicle had somehow veered off Lake Shore Drive and struck a concrete barrier at high speed. He had survived but sustained multiple fractures to both arms and extensive injuries that would require months of recovery. Police were investigating, but preliminary findings suggested mechanical failure, possibly brake malfunction. The story was reported as a tragic accident, nothing more. Victoria read the news on her phone while sitting in her apartment, and a cold certainty settled over her. This was not coincidence. Dominic had done this, or had it done, within 24 hours of learning what Castellan had done to her. The speed and efficiency of it was terrifying, as was the casual violence that had been deployed on her behalf. She should have been horrified, should have recognized this as confirmation of everything dark she had suspected about Dominic's world. Instead, what she felt was a complicated tangle of gratitude, fear, and something disturbingly close to satisfaction. She went to Dominic's penthouse that evening without calling ahead, needing to confront him directly about what he had done. The doorman recognized her now and let her up without question, another sign of how deeply embedded she had become in Dominic's life. She found him in his living room with a glass of whiskey, looking out at the city lights as though contemplating something weighty. When she demanded to know if he was responsible for what had happened to Castellan, Dominic did not insult her intelligence by denying it. He stated simply that no one was permitted to touch what belonged to him, that Castellan had been given a measured response appropriate to his transgression. Victoria felt anger flare at his phrasing, at the implication of ownership. She told him sharply that she was not his property, that she had not asked him to hurt anyone on her behalf. Dominic turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she had known him, his carefully controlled demeanor cracked. His voice rose as he told her that she was either deliberately misunderstanding the situation or refusing to see what was obvious to everyone else. They had stopped being merely employer and employee weeks ago. What existed between them now was something else entirely, something that gave him both the right and the obligation to protect her from men like Castellan. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, to insist that she did not need his protection or want to be the cause of violence, but before she could form the words, Dominic closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was not gentle or tentative like she might have imagined a first kiss between them would be. It was fierce and demanding, full of frustrated desire that had been building beneath the surface of their careful interactions for months. Victoria knew she should pull away, should maintain the last boundary between them, should recognize this as the moment when she still had a choice about what happened next. But her body responded before her mind could intervene, her hands reaching up to tangle in his dark hair, her mouth opening under his with a hunger that matched his own. Dominic pressed her back against the wall of windows overlooking the city, his hands moving over her body with possessive urgency, and Victoria did not resist. They made love there in the living room with the lights of Chicago spread out behind them like scattered diamonds, and it was simultaneously the best and most frightening thing Victoria had experienced. There was passion, but also a kind of desperation. As though both of them understood, they were crossing a line that would change everything. Dominic was intense and focused, demanding but attentive, and Victoria found herself surrendering completely to sensations she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Afterward, he carried her to his bedroom, a space she had never entered before, all dark wood and expensive linens. They made love again, slower this time, and Victoria felt tears slip down her cheeks, though she could not have said whether they were from pleasure or fear or grief for the person she had been before all of this began. Dominic kissed them away without comment, and eventually they fell asleep tangled together as the city hummed below them. Victoria woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find Dominic already awake, propped up on one elbow watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Reality crashed back over her in waves. She had just slept with a man who had arranged for someone to be hurt, possibly crippled, because that person had grabbed her wrist. She had given herself to someone who operated outside the law, who traded in secrets and leverage, who held her in his orbit through a combination of gratitude and desire, and something that might be love but could just as easily be Stockholm Syndrome. Dominic seemed to sense the spiral of her thoughts. He told her quietly that she could leave if she wanted to, that he would not prevent her from walking away, that their arrangement could continue on a purely professional basis if that was what she needed. But even as he said it, both of them knew it was a lie. She was already too deep in his world, had already compromised herself too thoroughly. And more than that, despite everything she knew she should feel, Victoria did not want to leave. She wanted to stay in this bed with this dangerous man who looked at her like she was something precious, who had protected her with brutal efficiency, who made her feel alive in a way she had not felt since before her parents died. She did not answer his offer with words. Instead, she kissed him again, a conscious choice made with open eyes, and felt him respond with relief and renewed desire. Whatever happened next, whatever price she would eventually pay for this decision, she was choosing it deliberately. She was choosing him, choosing this life, choosing to stop running and start living even if the life she was choosing existed in shades of gray rather than clear moral black and white. The transformation in their relationship from hidden to acknowledged happened gradually over the course of several weeks, though Victoria could not pinpoint exactly when the shift had become complete. Dominic stopped pretending that her presence at events was purely professional. He would arrive at gatherings with her on his arm, rather than having her slip in through service entrances. He introduced her to his associates not as staff, but as someone important to him. The exact nature of the relationship left deliberately vague, but clearly significant. Victoria found herself attending events in designer dresses that Dominic purchased for her, sitting at tables rather than serving them, engaging in conversations with Chicago's elite as though she belonged in their world. It was disorienting and uncomfortable at first, this sudden elevation from invisible server to visible companion. She struggled with imposter syndrome, certain that everyone could see through the expensive clothes and styled hair to the working-class woman beneath who had no business being in these rooms. But Dominic was patient and supportive, coaching her on social dynamics, teaching her which topics were safe and which were landmines, showing her how to deflect intrusive questions with grace. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in her presence at his side, his hand often resting possessively on her lower back or holding hers across dinner tables. Victoria noticed how people's attitudes toward her shifted when they understood she was under Dominic's protection. Doors opened more easily, service staff treated her with deference, and even the wealthiest attendees made efforts to be pleasant. The attention their relationship attracted was not universally positive. Victoria could feel the weight of curious stares, hear the whispers that followed them through rooms. Dominic had apparently kept his personal life extremely private for years, and his sudden appearance with a companion sparked intense speculation. Some people seemed genuinely happy for him, old friends who approached with warm congratulations. Others regarded Victoria with barely concealed envy or calculation, clearly wondering what she offered that had captured the interest of such a notoriously self-contained man. One person in particular seemed to view Victoria's presence with something darker than mere curiosity. Thomas Mackenzie appeared at a gallery opening in River North that Victoria attended with Dominic on a warm evening in early summer. He was a distinguished man in his early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of expensive casual style that suggested old money rather than new. Dominic's entire posture changed when he spotted Mackenzie across the room, a tension entering his shoulders that Victoria had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Mackenzie made no immediate approach, but Victoria felt his eyes on them throughout the evening, assessing and calculating. When Dominic was pulled into an intense conversation with a city alderman, Mackenzie materialized at Victoria's elbow with a glass of champagne and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He complimented her appearance with the smooth charm of someone accustomed to manipulating through flattery, then shifted into more pointed territory. He observed that she was clearly intelligent and beautiful, but suggested that she might be playing a more dangerous game than she realized. Victoria maintained her composure and deflected his comments politely, but Mackenzie persisted. He proposed that they meet privately, just the two of them, promising to share information about Dominic that she deserved to know. He implied that Dominic was keeping significant secrets from her, that she was being used in ways she did not fully understand. Before Victoria could respond, Dominic returned and Mackenzie smoothly excused himself, leaving Victoria unsettled by the encounter. She told Dominic about the conversation as they drove back to his penthouse that night. His reaction was immediate and dark. He warned her in no uncertain terms to stay away from Mackenzie, describing him as dangerous and unpredictable. He explained briefly that Mackenzie had been a former business partner, that they had parted ways after a serious conflict several years ago, and that Mackenzie had been looking for opportunities to damage Dominic ever since. But Victoria saw something else in Dominic's eyes when he spoke about Mackenzie, something that looked like fear or possibly guilt. She had learned to read his expressions over their months together, and this reaction suggested there were layers to the history between the two men that Dominic was not sharing. That night, as they lay in bed after making love, Victoria found herself staring at the ceiling and wondering what secrets the man beside her was keeping. What parts of his world remained hidden, even as she had surrendered so much to be part of his life. The curiosity ate at her over the following days. Dominic had always been honest with her about the general nature of his work, the information brokering and leverage that formed the foundation of his power. But she was beginning to suspect there were darker elements he had carefully kept out of her view. Mackenzie's words had planted seeds of doubt that grew despite her efforts to dismiss them. She told herself that Mackenzie was clearly trying to manipulate her, that trusting him would be foolish, but the questions remained. A week after the gallery opening, Victoria received a text message from an unknown number. It contained only an address in Lincoln Park and a time the following afternoon, along with a brief note suggesting that Mackenzie had information she needed to hear. Victoria stared at the message for a long time, knowing she should delete it and tell Dominic immediately. Instead, she found herself memorizing the address and telling herself she would just listen, that gathering information did not mean betrayal. The next afternoon, claiming she needed to run errands, Victoria took the train to Lincoln Park and found the address Mackenzie had provided. It was a quiet coffee shop on a tree-lined street, the kind of place where professionals worked on laptops and young mothers met for playdates. Mackenzie was already there, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance, looking more like a university professor than the dangerous man Dominic had described. He stood when she approached, gesturing for her to sit, and ordered her a coffee without asking what she preferred. Up close and in daylight, Mackenzie appeared younger than he had at the gallery, perhaps early 40s rather than 50s, with an easy confidence and warm manner that seemed designed to put people at ease. He thanked her for coming and acknowledged that she was probably taking a risk by meeting with him, which suggested intelligence and courage on her part. Then he began to tell her a story that systematically dismantled everything Victoria thought she understood about Dominic's world. He explained that Dominic was not simply an information broker who traded in corporate secrets and personal indiscretions. He was the head of one of the largest criminal organizations in the Midwest, controlling drug distribution networks, money laundering operations, and protection rackets across multiple states. The sophisticated intelligence gathering Victoria had been participating in was not about business advantage, but about territorial control and the elimination of rivals. Mackenzie painted a picture of Dominic as a crime lord who had built his empire through ruthless violence and strategic murders disguised as accidents or suicides. He claimed that the network of informants Dominic maintained was used to identify threats, corrupt officials, and maintain iron control over his operations. Mackenzie himself had been Dominic's partner in building this empire until he had discovered that Dominic had ordered the assassination of a federal prosecutor who was getting too close to their operations. The prosecutor had died in what was ruled a tragic car accident, but Mackenzie knew the truth and had confronted Dominic, leading to their explosive split. Victoria listened to all of this with growing horror, her coffee growing cold in front of her untouched. She had known Dominic operated in gray areas, had accepted that he was willing to use violence when necessary, but this portrait of systematic criminality and murder was something entirely different. Mackenzie watched her face as he spoke, clearly nodding her shock and using it to press his advantage. He told her that she was in danger, that Dominic's enemies would eventually target her to get to him, that her association with him had already marked her as complicit in his crimes. But he offered her a way out, a chance to escape with her integrity and her life intact. He would provide money for her to disappear, enough to relocate her and Caitlin anywhere they wanted to start over. He would ensure their safety from both Dominic and law enforcement. All he asked in return was information about Dominic's current operations, his connections to corrupt police and city officials, details that Mackenzie could use to bring down the organization that was poisoning the city. Mackenzie positioned himself as a man who had seen the error of his ways, who was now working to make amends by helping federal authorities build a case against Dominic. He appealed to Victoria's moral sense, suggesting that she had a responsibility to stop being complicit in Dominic's crimes, that her love for him was understandable but misplaced. He gave her a burner phone and told her to think about his offer, to call him when she was ready to do the right thing. Victoria left the coffee shop in a daze, her mind spinning with conflicting thoughts and emotions. She wandered through Lincoln Park for over an hour, barely seeing her surroundings, trying to process what she had learned and decide what to believe. Everything Mackenzie had said fit with pieces of evidence she had noticed but not fully acknowledged. The deference Dominic commanded went beyond respect into fear. The careful way he structured his operations suggested someone hiding serious criminality. The incident with Castellan had demonstrated his capacity for swift and brutal retaliation. But Victoria also knew that Mackenzie had his own agenda, that he was clearly trying to manipulate her for his own purposes. She had learned enough about information warfare from Dominic to recognize the techniques Mackenzie was employing, the mixing of truth and lies designed to create maximum doubt and confusion. The question was which parts of his story were true and which were fabrications meant to turn her against Dominic. She returned to the penthouse that evening feeling sick with anxiety and uncertainty. Dominic took one look at her face and knew immediately that something was wrong. He asked what had happened, his voice sharp with concern and something that might have been suspicion. Victoria had never been good at lying, and she found she did not want to start now, not with him. She told him about the meeting with Mackenzie, about everything the man had said, watching Dominic's face as she spoke. His expression turned to stone as she relayed Mackenzie's accusations, his jaw clenching and eyes going flat in a way that reminded her he was capable of extraordinary violence. When she finished, there was a long silence during which Victoria could hear her own heart pounding. Finally, Dominic asked her a single question. Did she believe what Mackenzie had told her? Victoria looked at the man she had come to love, searching his face for answers. She admitted that she did not know what to believe, that she needed him to tell her the truth, the complete truth without careful omissions or strategic framing. She needed to understand exactly who he was and what he had done. Dominic poured himself a whiskey and stood at the windows overlooking the city for a long moment before he began to speak. He acknowledged that the truth was complicated, that Mackenzie's story contained elements of fact mixed with deliberate distortions. Yes, he controlled criminal operations that went far beyond information brokering. Yes, he had used violence when necessary to protect his interests and eliminate threats. His organization was involved in activities that would result in significant prison time if federal prosecutors could build a solid case. But the story about the federal prosecutor was a lie, a particularly vicious one that Mackenzie had crafted to justify his own betrayal. The prosecutor in question had indeed died in a car accident, but the accident had been arranged by Mackenzie himself to eliminate a witness who was preparing to testify against him. Mackenzie had then attempted to frame Dominic for the murder, using it as leverage to take control of their shared operations. When Dominic had discovered the truth and refused to be blackmailed, Mackenzie had fled rather than face retaliation. Dominic explained that Mackenzie was now trying to use Victoria as a weapon against him, that the information Mackenzie was requesting would enable him to destroy not just Dominic's organization, but dozens of people who depended on it for their livelihoods and safety. The federal authorities Mackenzie claimed to be working with were more likely rivals looking to take over territory. Providing Mackenzie with what he wanted would trigger a war between criminal factions that would leave bodies in the streets and innocent people caught in the crossfire. He asked Victoria directly if she believed him, if she trusted that he was telling her the truth. Victoria stared into his eyes, searching for deception and finding only weariness and something that looked like pain. She realized that she was at a crossroads, that her answer to this question would determine everything that came after. She could choose to believe Dominic, to accept his version of events and remain in his world despite its moral complexities. Or she could believe Mackenzie, could take the offered escape and turn informant against the man she loved. Victoria told him honestly that she did not know who to believe, that both stories were plausible, that she needed time to think. Dominic nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. He told her that he understood, that this was a decision she needed to make for herself, but that she needed to understand the stakes. If she chose to work with Mackenzie, there would be no going back, no possibility of reconciliation. And if Mackenzie was lying to her, she would be responsible for consequences she could not begin to imagine. He left her alone in the penthouse that night, saying he had business to attend to, giving her space to think. Victoria sat at the windows looking out at the glittering city and felt more lost than she had since that February night when she had first accepted Dominic's offer. She had thought she was making clear choices, but now she understood that she had been navigating in fog, never quite seeing the full picture. The burner phone Mac Kenzie had given her sat heavy in her pocket, and somewhere in the city, two men waited to see which one she would choose to believe. The days after her meeting with Mac Kenzie stretched into a slow, suffocating blur. Victoria moved through Dominic's penthouse like someone half-submerged, completing ordinary tasks with a mind that would not stop circling the same questions. She went to events on his arm, checked messages from Philadelphia about Caitlin's progress, sat at the kitchen counter with coffee growing cold, and all the while replayed two competing stories about the man she loved and the man who claimed to be trying to save her from him. At night, when Dominic was out handling business he no longer bothered to disguise with vague language, she sat at the dining table with a notebook. In one column, she listed what she knew of Dominic, the network of informants and favors, the violence she had glimpsed through Castellan's accident, the surgeries and rehabilitation he had funded for Caitlin, the small, unguarded ways he tried to make space for her in his brutal world. In the other column, she wrote what she knew of Mac Kenzie, former partner, now supposed reformer, quietly working with unnamed authorities, walking around with a burner phone and a rehearsed story about justice and atonement. The more she wrote, the less simple any of it looked. Her instincts, the ones honed in Boston under Marcus and sharpened in Chicago, told her one thing clearly: neither man was harmless, and neither was telling her everything. Dominic admitted the existence of crime and violence, but insisted there were lines he would not cross. Mac Kenzie wrapped himself in the language of conscience, but had no problem asking her to sabotage Dominic from the inside. Both treated her as an asset in a larger game, even if Dominic also treated her as something more in the quiet hours between moves. Eventually, thinking stopped being enough. The part of her that had spent months observing powerful people in rooms where they forgot she existed pushed her toward action. She began her own quiet investigation, moving with the same unobtrusive care Dominic had trained into her. She asked careful questions of bartenders, valets, and security guards who had seen both men over the years. She listened to how people lower on the ladder talked when they believed they were only venting. Patterns emerged. Dominic's name carried fear, but it was a fear tied to the expectation that he kept his word. People described him as ruthless but predictable, dangerous but disciplined. There were stories of debts forgiven, of families quietly protected, and of men who had disappeared after crossing him. Mac Kenzie's name surfaced with more resentment than respect. He was remembered as someone who had worked with different factions over time, always managing to land on his feet when others did not. No one called either man a saint. No one described either as a man you could trust completely. Clarity, when it finally came, arrived through threat instead of reason. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen island drafting an email about Caitlin's physical therapy, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. The attached photograph showed Caitlin outside the rehabilitation center in Philadelphia, bundled in a coat, leaning on a cane. The angle and distance screamed surveillance rather than chance. The line of text beneath it was short and cold, reminding Victoria that distance meant nothing, that accidents could happen anywhere. The words did what Mac Kenzie's carefully constructed speeches had not. They stripped away his borrowed moral vocabulary and left only what he actually was, another man willing to endanger Caitlin to get what he wanted. The difference between him and Dominic no longer lay in guilt or innocence, but in honesty about methods. Dominic had never pretended his world was clean. Mac Kenzie had tried to wear integrity like a mask, while sending her a photograph of her injured sister as leverage. Fear hit first, sharp and physical, followed quickly by anger that felt like something solid in her chest. She had spent years outrunning one controlling man, only to find herself triangulated between two more powerful ones. There was nowhere left to run that they could not reach. That realization did not paralyze her. It forced a decision. If she could not escape the game, she would at least choose how to stand on the board. She replied to Mackenzie's message hours later, after the first wave of panic had cooled into something deliberate. She agreed to meet him, adopting the tone of someone who had finally surrendered to hard truth. He sent a time and an address in a deserted industrial strip near the river. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions. He wrote that this would settle things between them. To Victoria, it sounded more like a warning that she was nearing the point of no return. She did not lay everything at Dominic's feet before she left. Total reliance on him would have meant surrendering the last piece of autonomy she had been fighting to keep. Handling it entirely alone would have been suicide. So she chose something halfway. An hour before leaving, she scribbled the address and time on a scrap of paper and tucked it into a book on Dominic's nightstand that she knew he reached for often. On her phone, she quietly switched on location sharing and sent his lieutenant a short, innocuous text that would look harmless unless someone was already worrying about where she was. It was a thin insurance policy, but it was something. The industrial district was as bleak as she expected. Snow lingered in dirty piles along the curbs, and the air smelled of rust and river water. The warehouse Mackenzie had chosen looked abandoned, its windows blacked out, its brick walls layered with graffiti. Inside, the air was colder and still, the open space divided by rusting beams and tangled cables. Mackenzie stood near the center of the floor in a dark overcoat, flanked by two men who held themselves with the loose alertness of professionals. Victoria walked forward on legs that felt both weightless and heavy. Mackenzie regarded her with a smooth, satisfied expression, as if her presence confirmed his theory about what fear and conscience would make her do. He started to question her with practiced precision, asking about Dominic's security, his contacts in law enforcement, the way he moved money and information. When she hesitated or claimed ignorance, he adjusted his approach, reminding her calmly of Caitlin's vulnerability, of how fragile a recovering body was out on an icy sidewalk. For a brief moment, she considered giving him enough truth to satisfy him while holding back what might truly devastate Dominic's operation. But she had lived too long in rooms full of half-truths not to recognize the trap. Once she started talking, she would never be able to control what came next. Whether she cooperated or refused, she was already in danger. The difference was whether she stood there alone or not. The sound of engines outside cut through his words mid-sentence. More than one car, doors closing almost in unison, footsteps approaching with a rhythm that felt organized rather than random. Mackenzie's men tensed and moved toward the entrance, hands near jackets in ways that made their intentions obvious. Mackenzie's eyes narrowed, and for the first time he looked less certain of the outcome. The warehouse doors opened with controlled force. Dominic's people entered first, fanning out with the same professional efficiency Victoria had seen at events, only stripped of social veneer. They took positions that blocked exits without crowding into panic. Dominic followed them in, his coat dark against the concrete, his expression flat enough to be frightening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. What followed was quick and quiet. Mackenzie tried words first, casting the meeting as an attempt to help Victoria, to save her from Dominic's influence. His voice remained smooth, but his eyes flickered toward exits that no longer existed. One of his men reached for his inside pocket and was on the floor a second later with Dominic's security pinning him down. The other lowered his hands and stepped back, choosing survival over loyalty with visible calculation. Instructions were given in low tones. Weapons appeared and disappeared, and within minutes Mackenzie was disarmed and restrained, his elegance reduced to a man kneeling on cold concrete. Only when the immediate threat was contained did Dominic turn fully toward Victoria. Up close, she saw how tight his jaw was, how hard he was working to hold on to control. He checked her for injuries without touching her, his gaze moving from her face to her hands, to the way she stood. When he was certain she was unhurt, the anger could surface. He asked why she had come, why she had not told him everything, why she had chosen to stand in the middle of a trap set by a man they both knew was dangerous. She did not have a neat answer, only the truth that had been forming in her over sleepless nights. She told him she needed to see for herself, that if she had gone to him first, he would have made decisions for her, and she would have spent the rest of her life wondering if she had ever chosen him freely at all. She admitted she was afraid of losing the last scrap of control over her own story. It sounded small put into words, but it was the core of everything. After years of being pushed and pulled by men with more power, she wanted at least one decision to belong only to her. Something in his expression cracked at that. The fury remained, but layered beneath it was understanding and a kind of exhausted hurt she had not seen in him before. He gave a short nod to his men, and they hauled Mackenzie to his feet and led him out with as little noise as possible. Dominic did not explain what would happen to him. He did not have to. The absence of detail was its own answer. The drive back to the penthouse was silent. The city outside the car moved in streaks of color and light, but inside, everything felt suspended. Back in the apartment, with the door closed behind them and the skyline spreading out beyond the glass, Dominic finally laid out the choices as he saw them. He could arrange for new identities for her and Caitlin, somewhere far from Chicago. Enough money to live comfortably, enough distance to put physical space between them and the life he led. Or she could stay. Not as a coerced operative or a frightened dependent, but as his partner with full knowledge of what that meant. Constant risk, moral compromises, and a future that did not include clean endings. Hearing it framed that way, Victoria understood that there was no version of her life now that would feel morally pure. Leaving would not wipe away the last months. Caitlin's survival was already paid for with money that would never smell clean. The decisions she had made, the information she had gathered, the lies she had told were already part of who she was. Running would only add another layer of denial on top. She lay awake beside him that night, listening to the low hum of the city and the tiny changes in his breathing. In her mind, she tested lives she could lead if she walked away. A small apartment in another state, a decent job, afternoons at physical therapy with Caitlin, never having to see headlines and wonder if she had helped write them. The picture would not hold. In every version, Dominic existed at the edges, as a weight she would carry but never face. She would spend years wondering what had happened to him, whether he was alive, whether enemies had found him, whether federal agents had finally pieced together enough to break his world apart. The other possibility was messier but more honest, staying where she was, acknowledging the darkness instead of pretending it could be outrun. Accepting that she had already chosen him in hundreds of small ways and that leaving now would not turn those choices into mistakes. It would only turn them into regrets. She thought of Marcus and how she had escaped him by running. Dominic was not Marcus. He could be terrifying, but he had never lied about who he was. He had given her chances to walk away that she had not taken. When morning light began to cut pale lines across the ceiling, she turned toward him. He woke almost immediately, his eyes going to her face with a question he did not bother to voice. She told him she would not disappear. She would stay. Not because she was trapped, but because she had weighed the ugliness on all sides and decided that living with her eyes open, even in the gray, was better than spending the rest of her life pretending she was still the woman who had arrived in Chicago believing survival could be clean. His reaction was quiet. There was no victory in it, only a slow exhale and the loosening of tension she had not realized he had been holding. He did not promise that things would get easier or safer. He did not try to dress their life up as something it was not. He simply accepted her choice, and in doing so, acknowledged that it bound them together in a way no contract ever had. Later, standing with him at the floor-to-ceiling windows, Victoria looked out at the city that had remade her. Somewhere in its sprawl, men like Mackenzie were still making deals under fluorescent lights. Somewhere, cases were being built in quiet offices against organizations like Dominic's. Somewhere, Caitlin was taking careful steps down a hospital corridor, unaware of how close danger had come. There would be no storybook ending here, no easy line to draw between heroes and villains. There would be nights when news of an accident or an arrest would make her stomach twist. There would always be the risk of a knock at the door that changed everything. But as Dominic's hand closed around hers, firm and steady, she understood what she had done. She had chosen not the right answer, because there was none, but the answer she could live with. Him, this life, this hard, imperfect love in a world that had never been simple to begin with. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.